course you may. Thank you very much.
I want to take a picture with you.
Sure.
A rational course of action to take. It's really, as we would say, something of a no-brainer. If you keep your containers bottled up in ports or airports, if that slows trade down, it makes you poorer. All the evidence suggests this. Countries that move containers quickly, that are trading efficiently, tend to do better than those that do not. If you look around this part of the world, Singapore is a very good example. Hong Kong, these ports, if you look at the city of Shanghai, these are the world's 3 largest ports, and I think it's fair to say that those 3 places are all doing rather well. In other parts of the world, there's a great deal of difficulty. Now, of course, there are differing reasons for difficulty moving containers. If you are in West Africa and you are a landlocked country, you do not have control over the movement of your goods. You must rely on free movement through other countries. That's not always easy to obtain. Some of the issues that we're taking up here are quite simple, really. You're talking about a single window whereby exporters go to a single agency and all of their documentation can be delivered there. Rather than having to go to 10 or 15 agencies and to obtain 40 different signatures, they can simply go to one place. It's a one-stop shop. There are a range of other issues that are involved here as well, some of them technical, some of them political. And there's another element to this which is very important as well, which is technical assistance. Because many of our members, 2/3 to 3/4 of our members are developing countries, and they do not have the capacity to be able to implement an agreement, a binding agreement in the WTO. Remember that our agreements are bound. That means there's a legal obligation to follow through on these agreements, and a failure to so do can render you subject to the dispute settlement system, which is something that many developing countries worry about intensively. They do not wish to be confronted by highly skilled trade lawyers from the EU, Japan, US, or elsewhere. So there is real concern on their part that they may not be able to implement technical agreements such as this. So this agreement has something quite unique and innovative, which is a special section devoted to special and differential treatment for developing countries and technical assistance. This would provide for them the ability to stage in their commitments over time and to receive funds which would enable them to develop the capacity to implement these measures. Another very important issue before us is pertaining to agriculture. The group of 33 countries, which is chaired by Indonesia, has put forward an important proposal on food security. And what's happening is that under the WTO, all countries have obligations which limit the subsidies they can provide to agriculture. These subsidies are limited in terms of those subsidies which are trade distorting in nature. And the idea is that if you were to subsidize your farmers, they would produce surplus crops, surplus grains, which would then in turn be dumped on global markets and distort trade. This is something which for years has been an objective of developing countries, but as developing countries have reached higher levels of income, as their farmers have become more productive, you see that their production levels have gone up, and what they're trying to do is ensure that they can provide food for poor consumers through various food stockpiling programs, and which would not render them, again, subject to dispute settlement proceedings. Now, the proceedings that were put forward, the proposals put forward by the group of 33, include, they included 2 quite complex formulas, and the third option would be a peace clause. That is to say, there would be a period of time, an interim period, in which these countries would not be subject to any dispute settlement should they be in breach of their subsidy obligations. Now, what's happening is we are now discussing this intensively, and it looks as though we will be able to we believe, find some form of agreement here, but there are still questions outstanding. How long would this period of grace be extended? What kinds of safeguard measures could be undertaken to ensure that we would not have any spillover effect of these grains onto international markets. The last issue, there are two other issues in agriculture as well. One of them pertains to a way in which we would improve the monitoring and administration of quotas, import quotas in certain countries. There are developing countries who believe that in some countries the quota obligations, import quota obligations that have been undertaken are not being met. That is to say, these countries are not importing as much as they should be, and that this is hurting exporting countries in the developing world. This is coming along rather well. We should be able to get an agreement here. It's simply an exercise in enhanced transparency. It's always difficult to get a consensus among 159 countries. This is an area where we think agreement is possible. And then we have two issues one more issue in agriculture. The group of 20 agricultural exporting countries, not the global G20, these developing countries would like to see the rich countries reduce their export subsidy programs, all of them, including subsidized credits, by 50% by the end of this year. Developing countries, countries which have export subsidy programs, would be asked to reduce their subsidies by 25%. I should say to you that this is not a negotiation that's going well. It seems unlikely that these objectives would be achieved because there's resistance on the part of developed countries to undertake commitments such as this. This is one of the most important objectives that was laid out at the beginning of these negotiations, and there are many developed countries that believe that to pay this price now without getting market access in return is too stiff a price to pay. So on this, it's not clear as yet where our negotiations will end, but it's pretty certain that the overall objective of the G20 will not be achieved. Lastly, there's a couple of development issues. One is the creation of a monitoring mechanism which would ensure that the special and differential treatment provisions for developing countries would be adhered to. And the other is a formulation of rules of origin for least developed countries, which would ensure that their products are not held up at rich country borders as a result of disputed customs about the rules of origin of those products. Let me just say that since the arrival of our new Director General, Roberto Azevedo, at the beginning of September, there has been a steep acceleration in our negotiations. We are seeing real engagement, real negotiations for the very first time since 2008. We are moving in all areas. We are moving in a variety of different negotiating formats. The Director General is here now. He will be making a stopover in India. He'll be back briefly in Geneva, and then he goes to the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in Washington. He will be using the occasions in each of these places to stress the importance of these remaining weeks. He will make very clear that we do not intend for our Bali ministerial meeting to be a negotiating session, that we will really need to have virtually everything set and in place within the next few weeks. Our General Counsel must transmit to the ministerial conference final documentation by November, which means we really only have another couple of weeks. Beginning on the 14th of October, a very intensive period of 3 weeks of negotiation will commence, and at the end of those three weeks, we'll see whether we will have a deal or not. So there's a lot at stake. The Director General is going to make this point very clear to the ministers that he meets with today, as he did to G20 leaders in St. Petersburg, and as he will do to finance ministers and central bankers in Washington in the next few days. So I will stop there and take any questions. Yes, please, sir. Every country is permitted to provide subsidies. Thank you very much. To provide subsidies to their farmers. All countries are allowed to do that. The key is whether or not those subsidies are trade distorting. And the best way I think to assess that is, are the subsidies being provided linked to production? If I pay you a million rupiah per bushel of wheat that you grow, your incentive to grow more wheat goes up. And the more wheat you produce, if you have a bumper crop, you will produce a large amount of wheat which perhaps the market cannot consume. That surplus wheat then is dumped on global markets, very often at prices below the market in that country, and this has had a very injurious effect on developing country farmers. So the idea is to try and have subsidies which are for developing agriculture, which can be for infrastructure. There's a wide range of what we call green box or allowable subsidies. Now, providing food for poor consumers is certainly allowable under WTO rules. And what they're trying to figure out is a way in which governments can pay farmers to provide food for government stockpiles, which can then be released to poor consumers at very low prices, or even in the case of India, the new Indian law, they now give away 5 kilos of grain. And this is permissible. The key question is the price. If governments are buying at the market price, then there's no question of a subsidy. If it's an administered price, well then what is that price? It becomes quite complicated. In some countries it's very difficult to determine the market price. The market price for rice here in Bali may be different than what it would be in Surabaya or in Jakarta. And there's different reasons for why prices can vary to the extent that they have. So it's a complex idea. No one is opposed to the idea that governments can have programs of this nature. The disagreement is on, as I mentioned earlier, how to keep track of these programs, the key issue being the duration of the program, but also to ensure that these goods are not then somehow dumped on global markets. On the question of export subsidies, is that the nub of your question? If it's about export subsidies, then the biggest export subsidizers traditionally have been the US and the EU, but also Norway and Switzerland. But you have other programs as well that have, in some developing countries, including China, have allowed them to promote the export of their products. What the developed countries have said in the beginning of the Doha round, this was for many developing countries the most important issue. The situation has changed rather starkly because the price of grain has gone up so much that the subsidies given out by the United States and the European Union have plummeted. Most of these subsidies are form of price support, and since the price is already very high, the actual subsidy outlays have gone down. However, their commitments, what they're allowed to do under WTO rules, remain very high. They are far below those now. And in the case of the US and the EU, a cut of 50%, they would not even touch the existing expenditure. But what they say is they don't want to be constrained in that way. Absolutely. Just as it was very important to get the support we got in St. Petersburg from G20 leaders, just as it will be important to get the commitment from central bankers and finance ministers in Washington in the next few days. What is even more important, though, is that these very encouraging and helpful words of support are translated into concrete action at the negotiating table. We've had some very nice words that have been expressed over the course of the last 10 years, and unfortunately, they have not been translated into the kinds of negotiating progress that we need to have. We've been, for all kinds of reasons, certainly the crisis, while it's encouraging that governments did not embark on heavily protectionist programs and held the line really rather impressively, which is, I think, a tribute to the rules that have been in place in the multilateral trading system since the end of the Second World War. While that's very important, the appetite for further trade opening has been diminished considerably by the economic crisis. With some signs of recovery now, we're starting to see more enthusiasm for trade opening, and we're hoping that we'll be beneficiaries of this change.